I still check the ceiling every time I walk into a gas station. But why? How have I become so obsessed with this habit? It almost feels like a disorder, or maybe something I don't want to even imagine. My name is Travis Holloway, and I'm from Tulsa, Oklahoma. I grew up there, went to college at Oklahoma State, married my high school sweetheart, and for the last 8 years, I've been driving a logistics route between Dallas and Kansas City. 14-hour days behind the wheel of a Freightliner, listening to true crime podcasts and bad country music, and pretending the rest stops don't all start to look the same after a while. I've seen everything out there on those highways. Broken down rigs and meth heads, and the weird guy at every truck stop who wants to tell you about his system for winning at blackjack. You develop a kind of immunity to the strange after a few years. Your brain sorts it into categories: harmless, annoying, weird, but probably harmless, and the one category you learn to avoid entirely. I thought I had the whole map memorized. I was wrong. This happened last October. I'd been driving since about 6 that evening, heading back from my cousin's wedding in Fort Worth. Good time, too much cake, a little too much whiskey on Saturday night, which is why I was still on the road instead of asleep in my own bed like a reasonable human being. I was about 2 hours outside of Tulsa, somewhere between Ardmore and a town so small it barely qualified as a place, when my bladder made it very clear it had been making deals with my brain for the last 40 miles, and the deals had finally collapsed. I needed to stop, badly. And I needed coffee, because the whiskey had worn off about an hour ago, and I was starting to drift in that way that feels almost like sleep, but is actually just your brain slowly shutting down your grip on reality. I saw the sign for Bellamy's truck stop through the windshield, one of those old neon crosses where half the letters had burned out, so it just said BLEISTRKST. I pulled in, killed my headlights, and sat there for a second, letting the glow of the station wash over me like a little orange promise of restrooms and caffeine. The bell above the door went ding-dong when I walked in, so aggressively normal, it actually made me smile. The place was bigger than it looked from outside. High ceilings, industrial fans, aisles of snacks arranged the same as every other truck stop from here to California. The air smelled like burnt coffee and engine grease, and one of those little cinnamon rolls under the heat lamp, that sweet and sickly scent that clings to everything in places like this. Generic radio country was playing from a speaker near the ceiling, the kind of music that asks nothing of you. There was a woman standing in the back aisle near the chip display, her back to me, completely still, not shifting her weight, not reaching for anything, just standing with her shoulders square like a cardboard cutout. I thought that was weird, but figured I'd stand like that too after a long drive. I poured myself coffee at the station by the register and walked up to pay. Nobody was there. I waited maybe 30 seconds, looking around at the beef jerky and window washer fluid and cheap sunglasses, and everything looked exactly as it should. That's part of why it took me so long to realize something was wrong, because everything looked exactly as it should. I called out, "Hey, anybody working the counter?" My voice sounded weird in that space. Too loud, too flat, swallowed by the high ceiling and the soft country music. Nobody answered. I looked back at the woman in the aisle. She still hadn't moved. Not once. Not even a small shift. Not a weight transfer. Nothing. She was just standing there staring at the chip display like it contained the secrets of the universe. And I started to feel that little prickle at the back of my neck. That cold tickle that your body sends you when something is off before your brain catches up to figure out what. I pulled out my phone and pretended to check something, just to occupy myself. Because the idea of standing in a gas station at 2 in the morning, having a conversation with nobody, felt weirder than it probably should have. The woman's phone was in her hand. I could see it from where I was standing. A smartphone held up in front of her face at chest height. The screen was black. She was staring at a black screen, not scrolling, not reading, just standing there in the middle of an aisle at 2 in the morning, staring at a phone that was turned off, like a zombie who'd found religion through a device that had died. I put my phone away and got a little closer, just a few steps, and that's when I smelled it. It came in all at once, like someone had opened a door somewhere in the back of the store and let out a wave of air that had been sealed away for a long time. Copper, old pennies, the smell of a penny that's been in someone's pocket for years, mixed with something else. Rust, like a pipe that's been leaking for months. That mineral tang that gets into everything. I knew that smell. I'd smelled it before, years ago, when my uncle's workshop had flooded, and they'd found a dead raccoon under the insulation a week later. But this was stronger, fresher somehow. Like the thing that was making the smell was closer than a flood victim under some insulation. It was concentrated near the front of the store, around the main aisle, and it was spreading. I looked up at the ceiling, just reflex, looking for a clock, a camera, anything. And that's when I saw them. Hanging from the blade of the ceiling fan, the big industrial one that was mounted over the main aisle like a slow propeller of dusty air, were a pair of work boots. Brown leather, steel-toed, the kind you'd wear on a job site or a ranch. They were suspended by their laces, which were tied together in a knot and looped over the fan blade, dangling maybe 6 feet off the ground, close enough to the fan that in another foot they'd be catching the blade's rotation. One lace was longer than the other and dragged down toward the floor, swaying gently, that pendulum swing you see when someone has just jumped down from something and the residual energy is still carrying them. I remember my first thought was that it was some kind of decoration. A weird truck stop aesthetic choice. Like they were going for that rural Americana vibe, but accidentally committed a felony about it. My second thought came when I realized the fan wasn't running. The blades were stationary. I could see the dust on them, thick gray dust, the kind that takes months to build up on a surface that nobody touches. The fan wasn't running, but the boots were swinging, slow, steady, back and forth, like something had just set them in motion and they didn't know how to stop. I set my coffee down on the counter. I set it down carefully, both hands. The way you'd set something down if you were afraid the sound of putting it down too hard might wake something up. The boots kept swinging. And then the woman looked up from her black phone. She looked up slowly, and the motion of it was wrong. Not the way a person looks up, but the way something wearing a person looks up. With that delay between the intention and the movement that you see in videos when someone's internet connection is lagging. Her neck craned upward. Her face turned toward me. Her eyes found mine, and they were open, but they looked empty. Not like someone zoning out, but like someone whose body had been temporarily borrowed and the original occupant had stepped out. Her phone screen was still black. She opened her mouth and spoke, and her voice was flat and toneless, not her voice at all. Like someone reading a line they'd memorized phonetically without understanding what it meant. And she said, "He'll be out in a minute." She said it with the certainty of a weather report. Then she turned back to her phone and resumed staring at the black screen like nothing had happened. I didn't wait. I turned and walked toward the door, and the bell went ding-dong on the way out, and the sound was so ordinary and so wrong in that moment that it made my teeth hurt. Something in my chest opened up with pure animal terror, the kind your ancestors must have felt when they heard a branch snap in the dark, and I walked fast, and then I ran. I made it to my car in what felt like 6 seconds, but was probably 3. I don't remember the details. There's a gap in my memory from the moment the door closed behind me to the moment I was sitting in the driver's seat with both hands on the wheel and my knuckles white, staring through the windshield at the gas station like it was a sleeping animal I was trying not to wake up. I was breathing too fast. I could hear my own breath, ragged and shallow, and I could feel my heart slamming against my ribs like it was trying to escape, like it knew something I hadn't figured out yet. The copper smell was faint in the open air, but it was still there, clinging to my nostrils, and I could taste it at the back of my throat like I'd swallowed a mouthful of old coins. I fumbled for my keys, dropped them on the floor mat, picked them up, dropped them again. My hands were shaking the way they do after you've had too much coffee or not enough sleep, except this was neither, and I could feel my fingers trembling against the key fob like they were trying to communicate something my brain wasn't ready to hear. I got the key in the ignition. The engine caught on the first try, which felt like a small miracle, and I pulled out of that parking lot fast enough that the tires screamed on the asphalt, and I drove down that state route at exactly 40 miles an hour, which is how fast I know I was going, because I kept looking at the speedometer and being aware of the absurdity of being that scared and that slow at the same time, like I was trying to outrun something while also trying not to attract its attention. I made it about 2 miles before I looked in the rearview mirror. The lights went out, all of them. Every light in that building went dark at the exact same instant, like someone had thrown a main switch, and for a second, the station was just a black shape against the Oklahoma night, a hole in the landscape where a building used to be. And in that darkness, I saw it, a shape in the doorway, standing exactly where I'd been standing less than 3 minutes ago. Too far away for details, too dark for specifics. But it was there, and it was facing the road, and it was facing me. And I know how this sounds. I know it sounds like what happens when a tired trucker convinces himself he's seen something, because his brain is running on fumes and fear. But I wasn't tired. I was awake in a way I hadn't been awake in years. Every sense dialed up to 11, and I saw that shape standing in that doorway, and I saw it not move, not even slightly, like it had been waiting a long time for someone to look back at it. I floored it. The Freightliner would have eaten up that road at 80, but I was in the Civic that week because the rig was in the shop, and the little Honda responded with a surge that felt almost personal, like the car was as scared as I was and was finally on my side. And I watched the road unspool ahead of me in my headlights while my heart tried to claw its way out of my chest. I drove to Tulsa at 70, which is about as fast as that Civic would go on a good day with a tailwind, and I didn't stop until I was in the parking lot of a Denny's on the edge of town, sitting in the glow of the orange signage with my headlights still on and my hands still shaking, and I just sat there for a long time. I sat there and I looked at my coffee cup in the cup holder, a coffee cup I hadn't paid for, a coffee cup that was still warm, and I thought about the woman and the boots and the smell and the voice that came out of that woman's mouth. And I thought about what "he'll be out in a minute" actually means when it's said like that, without question or hesitation, like it was a fact that had already been decided long before I walked through that door. I called the police from the Denny's parking lot. I sat there with the engine running because turning it off felt like surrender. Like, if the engine was running, then I was still moving. still in control, still going somewhere. And I wasn't just sitting in a parking lot at 4 in the morning waiting for something to catch up. A dispatcher answered, a woman with a calm voice. The kind of voice they train you to use when people call in scared and confused. And I told her I'd stopped at a gas station on the state route and that something felt wrong there. She asked me what I meant by wrong, and I opened my mouth to explain, and I realized I didn't have anything concrete to say. There was a woman not using her phone. There was a fan not running. There were boots hanging from it, swinging. I could hear how it sounded as I said it, and it sounded like nothing. It sounded like the ramblings of a man who'd been driving too long and drinking too much at a wedding and half asleep at the wheel of his life. But the dispatcher took the location. Somewhere between exit 47 and the next town, I told her, which is not a real answer, but it was the best I had. And she told me a unit would be dispatched, and she told me to stay in a public place, which I was already doing, eating a grand slam at 4 in the morning in a Denny's booth, while the waitress refilled my coffee without asking, because she could see that I needed it more than most people who'd been in that booth at that hour. I don't remember most of that food. I remember the eggs. I remember looking at the eggs under the fluorescent lights, yellow and glistening, almost too bright. And I remember thinking that if I could just keep looking at something normal and bright and real, I could keep my brain from sliding into whatever dark corner it kept trying to crawl into. The eggs were the last thing I ate. I'm not sure why I stopped. I just remember that the eggs were the last thing I could look at without seeing the boots. The police called me back at 6 in the morning. I was still in the booth, hadn't moved, couldn't make myself go, because going meant the sky and the open road, and a world where a deputy sheriff was about to tell me the gas station was fine, or wasn't, and I needed to know which before I could function again. Deputy Reyes had that careful, calm voice when she said a unit had responded, and the station appeared to be closed, chained from the outside, condemned 2 months ago due to safety violations. The unit had entered the property, and the interior was empty. No woman, no attendant, no recent sign of habitation. The shelves were still stocked, which she admitted was unusual, but not actionable. I asked about the boots. She paused. There were no boots. The ceiling fan in the main aisle wasn't even connected to a power source. It was decorative, coated in dust so thick it would have taken months to build up. The back rooms were empty too. She asked if I'd like to give a formal statement, and I said yes, because yes felt safer than no. I drove to the sheriff's department, sat in a plastic chair that smelled like burnt coffee and industrial floor cleaner, and talked for 40 minutes while she wrote it all down. At the end, she looked at me with that face, the careful face of someone who had decided to believe me, the way doctors believe hypochondriacs, with professional compassion and zero actual conviction. And she gave me a case number and a card with a hotline on it and told me to call if I remembered anything else. I didn't. I only wished I could forget the things I already had. I drove back to Dallas that same morning. I couldn't stand being in Oklahoma anymore. Not because I don't love the state, it's home, but because the geography had become contaminated. Every mile of highway between Tulsa and that station felt like a thread connecting me to something I didn't want to be connected to, and I needed to get to the other end of that thread, behind the Dallas city limits, where the roads are grid straight and well lit, and the gas stations have motion sensor lights and security cameras with blinking red eyes. I slept for 2 days straight when I got back. Not real sleep, just that half-conscious state where the boots were always there, not haunting me, Just present the way your front door is present when you're sitting in your living room, swinging slow and patient. And the copper and rust smell was there too, the signature of something I couldn't name and couldn't forget. I started avoiding gas stations, not consciously at first. I just found myself driving past them, adding miles to my route to avoid the Shell station 4 blocks from my apartment because it had a ceiling fan above the air pump. And every time I pulled in, I looked up and my stomach dropped 3 inches. My roommate Dave asked me about it one night, and I mentioned it casually, the way you'd mention a weird dream, something to laugh about, and he laughed and said it sounded like a creepypasta. And I laughed too because he was right. I wanted it to be a creepypasta, something I'd read on the internet and half remembered and convinced myself I'd experienced, because that would mean it wasn't real. But the smell was real. The boots were real. The woman's voice was real. And I couldn't laugh about it for long without feeling something cold move around in my chest, something heavy and settled, like a stone that had been dropped in water and had finally reached the bottom and come to rest there, permanent, part of the landscape of my body. 3 weeks later, I got a flat tire on the same state route. I looked up and saw the sign, Bellamy's, half the letters still flickering, parking lot empty, weeds pushing through the asphalt. I should have called a tow truck. Instead, I finished tightening the lug nuts and drove to the station and parked in the same spot I'd parked in 3 weeks ago. And I looked at that side door, the one employees used, and it was open, just slightly, just enough for a sliver of darkness to be visible inside. I walked across the parking lot, the weeds brushing against my jeans, and the closer I got, the less I felt the fear, and the more I felt that vast, heavy, terrible calm that comes right before something shifts and everything changes. I pushed the door open. The hinges screamed, a long, rusty scream that went on longer than it should have, and I stepped inside. It was dark, enough light through the boarded windows to make out the shapes of the aisles, the shelves, the counter, the coffee station. The air was thick with dust, and that smell, copper and rust and something older, something that had been sealed in that building long before the county chained the doors. I walked down the main aisle and stopped under the ceiling fan. It was empty, just old metal and old dust. I stood there feeling almost relieved, almost triumphant, like walking into a room that scared you once and discovering it's nothing. It was never anything. I turned to leave, and that's when I heard it from the back hallway. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, getting closer. And underneath the footsteps, faint but unmistakable. Breathing, not hurried, not startled, just slow, patient. The breathing of something that had been waiting for a very long time and was in no hurry at all. I ran. I jumped in my car and drove 100 miles an hour to the Dallas city limits and didn't stop until I was in my apartment with every light on, Dave asking what was wrong, and I couldn't answer him. They found the station burned down 2 weeks later. Electrical fire, the report said. Nobody investigated much. It had been condemned. Deputy Reyes closed the case file. I told her no, nothing else to add, and that was it. Case closed, building gone. Just ash and chain link and that stretch of road where every passing headlights looks like the station sign, flickering. Half the letters burned out, and I drive it every week, and every time I pass that exit, I look the other way. But here's the thing I can't stop thinking about. When I stood under that fan in the dark, the floor was covered in dust. Thick dust, undisturbed, weeks of it. There were no footprints, no signs of recent entry. No one had been in that building for months, except me, except the thing whose footsteps I heard from the back hallway, except whatever has been in that hallway since long before Bellamy's was condemned. Something slow and patient and waiting, that knows what I look like now, and knows that I went back, and knows that I know it's there. And I still can't walk past a fan at any gas station without looking up.